professor at Tennessee School of Journalism and Electronic Media. She teaches media history and its relation to the culture. And she's a former sports writer and magazine editor, so she has a broad background. And we welcome her again today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. I love my time with you all so much. I'm getting into the space you suggested, don't worry. So thank you all for inviting me back. In February, you may remember, I was with you all, and I completely detoured from what I had planned to say, which was a lot of the material here that you'll see today. But honestly, I kind of think that I ended up delivering to you all more of a personal and cultural truth, which is, as writers, we desperately need to be sharing our truth. The truth that only we are prepared to tell, right? And after my talk last time, I had some great conversations with you all and forged some great friendships with folks in the room and was able to kind of help spread the word about the great works of individuals like Sonia Dubois, and it's been such a pleasure. So once again, thank you so much for having me back. As you'll see in the materials that I prepared for today, really some of my sources of inspiration on writing are likely some of yours, right? Ernest Hemingway and Joan Didion, for instance. I particularly have a soft spot in my heart for the work of Joan Didion. And after she passed away in late December of 2021, I happened to be in New Orleans on a secret trip. I guess I just let the cat out of the bag. But I walked over to Faulkner's bookstore and I purchased her last copy of collected essays. Let me tell you what I meant. And I really fell in love with something that had been republished in that collection of essays, Why I Write, which is something that she delivered in a Regents lecture to her alma mater at the University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley. She says that she really started to write to sort out the pictures in her head, right? And that's really why I think that I write, right? It's for myself first and foremost, and then for audiences. And we'll talk a little bit more about audiences in my last few remarks about marketing. But I love this quote from her. Look hard enough and you can't miss the shimmer. It's there. You can't think too much about these pictures that shimmer. You just lie low and let them develop. You stay quiet. You don't talk to too many people, and you try to locate the cat in the shimmer, the grammar in the picture. And there, in 7 deceptively simple sentences, 54 words, Didion explained her process as a writer before sharing the infinite power of grammar, one in which not only every word, but every letter counted. Now, certainly when I was a sports reporter at the Gainesville Times down in Gainesville, Georgia, I didn't necessarily have time to think about every single word that I wrote because there was the deadline pressure of an everyday newspaper. But that has been, since all those years ago, something that I really do think so much about, right? Making certain that every word counts. You'll also see that I have a passage from True Stories. It's a book by Norman Sims, who is really kind of a foremost voice in literary journalism, a subject matter that I am a huge proponent of and teach from time to time at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And I love this particular passage as it relates to Ernest Hemingway. So Hemingway was an accomplished literary journalist. And Hemingway's journalism can be called literary because it sought to tell a story, to communicate a slice of real life to readers, rather than detail facts, interpretations, or descriptions for their own sake. That's another one of my primary objectives. I want to share with my readers, my audiences, extended from there, a slice of real life, right? And that's really probably what my talk in February and my talk today have in common, right? If you're not trying to communicate a real slice of life, then what are you doing being a writer, right? Go find another pursuit, passion. There's coin collecting after all, right? That is kind of our primary purpose or objective, to interpret a real slice of life. And that's certainly something that I sought to do as a working journalist and that I still seek to do as a historian. And so now I kind of come to you with my first book, and one of the things that I always try, look at here, I'm trying to walk out of your frame already. You see that energy of mine, makes me want to walk out of a frame. That's why I didn't make it in Hollywood. I kept walking away from the... So you'll see that that's something that I really try to do with all of the words that I write, communicate a real slice of life. And I feel like I try to do that in my first book, which was called Inventing Baseball Heroes, Ty Cobb, Christy Mathewson, and the Sporting Press in America. And I try to do it from cover to cover based in my source material, but also in spaces such as the preface and the prologue. I tried to give my readers a sense of why I had come to this particular material in the first place. And so I will share with you just a snippet from the book, even though I know my time today with you all is short. As a young girl in the 80s, I spent countless hours playing catch with my father in our backyard. On those early summer evenings before the lightning bugs came out to play, I liked to pretend that I was Ty Cobb, the Georgia peach. My goal was simple, to hit a line drive over the rickety shed near the forest. Doing so would not only earn the pride of victories, but the spoils, a Dairy Queen ice cream sundae. Connecting with that perfect pitch, however, was elusive. Even so, each evening as the dusk settled on the foothills of northeast Georgia, I begged for just one more pitch, one more chance to meet my destiny. I go on in this prologue to describe what it was that brought me to this subject matter of myth-making and image craft. It was really my own professional career as a sports journalist, way back at the Gainesville Times in Gainesville, Georgia. I was really interested in a couple of facets that I wanted to actively search out from the historical record. One was just this idea of myth-making. There went a pen. This idea of myth-making and the role that journalists were actively playing in the early 20th century in terms of kind of taking prominent sports stars and helping make them famous to a nation of emerging baseball lovers, right? And then the second aspect that I found myself really interested in was really rooted to a series of stories that I had done for the Gainesville Times down in Gainesville, which was about Middle League baseball. And that's actually a subject matter that I'd like to get back to in my professional career, because you see in so many textile mill towns in this region, which extended into Tennessee, baseball was really the center of community life in really the first half of the 20th century. I think you could make a really solid argument about that. And it's something that I kind of want to, as I suggested, get back to, but it's something I reported on there in the early 2000s about these individuals who had participated in those Mill League teams, and then a lot of the myths that had emerged around them. So one of the myths in Gainesville was that Fidel Castro's son played in one of those teams, and also that Shoeless Joe Jackson, years after he had retired after the Black Sox scandal, continued to find his way back on some of those Mill League teams that he had found his start on. So that is one of the things I always hope to do, which is this idea of recovering the memory of things said and done. And so you can even see that in my prefaces, my prologues. But then I really always hope to take a scene from the past and make it as real to readers as possible. And in many ways, you can do that by trying to make archival artifacts tangible and real to your readers. And so when I worked on this edited volume, I had a couple of chapters in it. It's called Political Pioneer of the Press, Ida B. Wells Barnett and Her Transnational Crusade for Social Justice. You'll see on the slide, if you have a copy of my presentation in front of you, there's this tattered image that's been digitized thanks to the wonderful work of archivists at libraries, in particular, in this case, the University of Chicago. And so from that image and from newspaper accounts of this particular time, I focused this particular chapter around the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett and her interest in women's rights and particularly suffrage by kind of trying to bring readers into the picture. So I start in September 1914, 10-year-old Alfreda Wells, sporting a white taffeta and lace dress and braided pigtails, gazed into the camera with a serious expression from her perch atop an ornate end table. Her mother and 13-year-old sister Ida Jr. flanked her, both donning frank expressions in their Sunday finest. The attire and countenance of Ida B. Wells Barnett and her daughters signified their mother's commitment to abiding the mores of middle-class respectability and her determination to struggling for equity and social justice for her children. The chapter goes on to talk about the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett with the Alpha Suffrage Club and how she used every media vehicle at her disposal, most notably the Chicago Defender, to share the work that she was doing within her community. In addition to really focusing on sharing a slice of real life with my readers and focusing on making every single word count, making my readers aware of a particular historic time and place, making the artifact become real to them, I also kind of later in my career, I hope I'm not late in my career yet, but about 10 years into my career, I've started to experiment with kind of flash forwards and flashbacks in my writing, which as a historian is tough sometimes, right? And so with my latest book, which is called Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign, I thought it was really important to start the book front and center with election night in 1976, because that, after all, was, you could argue, the pinnacle of Carter's success. At another point, I make the argument that the pinnacle of Carter's success politically was even that July at the Democratic National Convention in New York. But really, this is the moment in which we recognized as a country, through the work of journalists, that Carter was really a miracle man, right? That's how Time put it, because of his rise from a virtual unknown candidate to the presidency there. And so I start there, and then I circle kind of back to election night in 1980 and at the end of the book and talk about kind of how the Miracle Man ultimately failed in his permanent campaign for the presidency, really due to struggling to manage mediated images of events that happened during his presidency, most namely the Iranian hostage crisis. But so those are kind of things I really always like to try to put readers and audiences into the thick of the scene of an action with any topic that I come to. But as I understand it too, one of the things you were hoping to hear from me today was any tips that I might have on marketing. And so the final page of the presentation that I've prepared for you all is just a couple of screenshots from my website, and I'm hoping to run through some of my tips in terms of marketing in the age of self-promotion, because that's really where we're at, isn't it? As I sat and listened to the business in your business meeting before, being able to come up and chat with you today, so much of what we're talking about is how to make local audiences within our community, within this region, aware of what we write, right? And y'all have some great ideas about that. I love the idea, for instance, of the book club, right? And equally the idea of back to books, because as a mom who is, counting down the days, I love my kiddo, he's 8, but counting down the days until Knox County Schools starts up again, I agree with you. There just isn't much time for reading. And it really is nice to have structured spaces to engage in conversations about books. In fact, I think you could make a really good argument that that's what's wrong with our world, that there aren't enough of these kinds of spaces. And so I love the idea of how you're partnering with local bookstores, which I think are key community members, to get out the message about your work. I would highly encourage you to also take advantage of the kinds of channels at your fingertips. You've got one in your hand, start at your phone, right? And so I think, developing a website based upon your book is really easy and important work. That's something that that's something that now Emeritus Professor Jim Stovall taught me. Get out there on the web and take up that domain name of your book before anybody else gets the idea to, right? And then develop a good site from it. There's so many spaces, from Blogger to WordPress, in terms of developing a good website for you. And honestly, I think in terms of website development, that it's worth investing a little bit of money into, because I would argue that the more money that you invest in promoting your book, kind of the higher return of investment or on investment that you'll see. Be out there in the social media landscape as much as you can. And then, I think any space that you can have a conversation about your book, you should, right? Maybe that space for you is here in this room. Maybe it's in the K through 12 classroom, right? Maybe it's at bookstores, or maybe it's in spaces like podcasts, right? Or the local newspaper. It's not dead, folks, right? It still exists out there. And one of the things that I did after I published Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign is I started to participate in the Washington Post. They had a regular feature. It was called Made by History. And so I started contributing regular columns because, as you all know, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but man, there are overtones from the past in our present moment, right? And so I was kind of teasing out a lot of those connections in the columns that I did for the Post. And so really, I would just advocate for any space that you can have a good directed conversation around your work, wherever it may be. I think, and recognizing even, like this book I published in 2020, and it was right at the height of COVID. It came out in May. What were we all doing in May of 2020? We were at home, right, on lockdown. No bookstores were doing book talks. And in fact, many bookstores are just starting to revive that tradition now. And so I was able to use like Facebook Live with LSU Press and coordinate with bookstores in the region to offer online conversations that ultimately were recorded and are there to be reutilized as much as you would like, right? So kind of think beyond the traditional outlets perhaps as well. And then, that's certainly also what I did with this book, Inventing Baseball Heroes. I kind of became a regular on the vintage baseball circuit. You laugh, but it's a real thing. And they play here in Knoxville and in Nashville, and it was all the rage for a minute. And so I would march out on, hot, scalding summer afternoons and go talk about my book, in the dirt with these folks. And, even I can remember having a kiddo who was probably just a little bit older than my son is now, 10, who was like, I think I'm interested in this book. And I said, well, you always want to be honest with your readers. It might be a little bit over your reading level right now, but you might really enjoy it in a couple of years. And his daddy ended up buying a copy for him. Out of that, I was invited, there's an annual conference of vintage baseball lovers, and I went and gave a keynote for them. So I think that kind of any connection, right, that you can find, just making the most of it and not being scared to do so, right? I keep circling back because in part I just had to do so much of book promotion with the Carter book online. I keep circling back to see if local bookstores would be interested in talk. As a result of that, Union Ave bookstore, which is located, now see, this is some real self-promotion that I was trying to subtly weave and then recognized it wasn't so subtle. Union Ave bookstore over in downtown Knoxville is going to host a book chat, an author chat for me on October 1, which is leading up to President Carter's 99th birthday. So if you are down in downtown Knoxville on October 1, that afternoon, you'll stop by. I'll certainly share that information with Sam and hope that he shares it with you all. But I think I could have, after May of 2020, knowing that bookstores like to have author book talks right after a book is published, I could have just I don't want to damage the book. I could have just thrown this to the side and, put my hands up, right? But I think it's really important to, if you take the time and share those interpretations of the real slice of life to get those messages out to the greater public. Now, as I understand it, I think my time is running a little short. I do wonder if y'all have any questions for me. I tried to share lots of info with you all and tried to not get off on a different track. I could have told y'all about the emerging crisis today, but I didn't. It's at the university level this time.
So in your online promotion for your latest book, was it mostly social media channels?
Yeah, the website that I developed, and then various other social media outlets from Facebook. Like I said, I did a talk on Facebook Live with LSU, and then gave a lot of kind of requested talks, podcasts. But you know, but then sometimes one thing leads to another. I'll give you a great example of that. So, honestly, don't know how PBS found me. PBS found me. Sometimes people find you. And I did a documentary, was a guest for a documentary about Jimmy Carter. And as a result of that, and of course, you know what, in documentaries, they never take, you get interviewed for hours and hours, and then they take one thing, you know, like, so, but I mean, in my defense on that particular documentary, I have as much airtime as David Letterman, but one of the things they've got me saying is like, oh, Billy, which I mean, I think if y'all know Jimmy Carter and you know Billy Carter, I think anyone would say, oh, Billy. But that's kind of one of my key pieces in that documentary is like waving my hands at Billy Carter. But I mean, I think anyone from Georgia would do that. That's where I'm from originally. So, oh, Billy. But being a part of that documentary, as we found out news, of course, that President Carter was entering his final days in hospice care, that a lot of media outlets sought me out from that.
What about Habitat? Have you collaborated with Habitat?
You know what? I have not.
That's a big one because you could actually do fundraisers, and then it's a win-win. It would help your book, because they love Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter with that nonprofit has had more money than anybody.
I know. That's a great idea.
Yeah. So
I haven't thought about that, but that is a great idea. Yeah. Any more questions y'all might have for me?
I have just a comment.
Okay.
You're talking about Jimmy Carter. My very first book was Fly Fishing Always, and I asked Jimmy Carter if he would write a little introduction, and he did.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a signed introduction in the book.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Speaking of, I mean, you can think what you want about its presidency. You know, I mean, the typical verbiage is that it's a failed presidency.
Yeah.
I think
But still.
historians might look at it a little differently at some other point in time. But talk about one of the most genuine human beings, I think. And I had an opportunity to interview President Carter in 2015, but it was an opportunity I had to win the hard way. I requested several interviews. He was limiting his interviews for research purposes by that point in his life. And so with the last request, I sent a copy of this book, because a lot of people don't know, but Jimmy's a huge baseball fan. And in fact, his press secretary, Jody Powell, who's passed now, he did a voiceover on Ken Burns' documentary about baseball. Anyway, long story short, I sent him a copy of this book, and I inscribed it, and reminded him that, you know, this is a gal from Winder, Georgia, which is where I'm from. And sure enough, I got that interview. But in ways I talk about, sometimes I think I wrote this book to get to this book. Yeah. So that happens too in life. All right. Well, thank y'all so much for inviting me back. I really, really love this group, and look forward to hopefully one day being a member of your community.
Hey.